Hello, everybody. Thank you again for joining us today. You've logged on to the Regulatory Compliance Associates webinar, Data Integrity in the Age of AI, Securing Connected Devices. Now, if you missed one of our webinars or simply would like to refer to one, you can always find them on the RCA website on the On-Demand Webinars page listed under Resources. You can also receive notifications for upcoming live webinars and on-demand webinars by signing up for the RCA newsletter or following us on LinkedIn. Regulatory Compliance Associates, RCA, a Nelson Labs company, provides comprehensive regulatory, quality, and compliance consulting services to the pharmaceutical, biologics, sterile compounding, and medical device industries. With a team of more than 500 global experts, RCA helps life science organizations navigate complex FDA and international regulations, develop and maintain robust quality systems, and remediate compliance challenges. From inspection readiness to regulatory submissions to product development and post-market support, RCA partners with clients across the product life cycle to ensure safety, efficacy, and compliance. Now, let's get started. Today, we're joined by Susan Schneep and Jason Tugman. Sue is a distinguished fellow for RCA, and Jason is our cybersecurity subject matter expert. I'll let them both share some more of their background at the beginning of the presentation. Before we begin, I do encourage questions, so please submit them at any time in the questions box below. Sue and Jason will try to answer as many as they can in the last 10 to 15 minutes of the webinar. Now, to begin today's presentation, I turn it over to Sue and Jason.
Yes, thank you. Brandon, are you moving the slides? Can you move the...
Yes, I am.
Oh, there we go. Okay, so Jason and I have teamed up to bring you the contents of this webinar. What we're going to cover today on the agenda is, can you move the slide? Yeah, okay, the background on data integrity and some history. I just want to make sure people understand where these requirements are coming from. Then the term ALCOA, which has turned into ALCOA plus plus and then plus plus plus. Jason's going to cover like the current regulatory landscape, what's going on across the globe regulatory wise. We'll have challenges with cybersecurity and artificial intelligence and how that works and how you can embed that into your processes, the data life cycle and risk in that. And then we'll have hopefully a lively discussion between Jason and myself about ethics and oversights in this new emerging expertise. And then we'll do some lessons learned and practical insight and have questions from the audience. So whenever I do one of these, I always look a webinar and talk about data integrity, or if I'm giving a seminar presentation, or even just talking to people about data integrity, I like to give you a definition. And the one that I have is, to me, kind of like the best one I've run across. So it's ensuring that your data is, you can see, accurate, complete, intact, maintained, right? And it denotes validity. Ensuring data integrity means protecting original data. So what does all of that actually give you, right? In the end, you're following some of these ambiguous definitions, and what does it give you? What I like to tell people is that the data is what's really important when it comes to product release, whether you're pharmaceutical or medical device. When at the end of the day, when you release your product to the patient to be used and utilized in the field, the only thing that you have to stand on in terms of safety and efficacy is that data. And so it's important that you treat that data very, I don't want to say gingerly, but that you treat it with respect, that you make sure that it meets all of these elements of ALCOA, ALCOA plus plus, whatever you're into there. You want to treat it with respect, because that is what you have. It's the only thing you have to fall back on should you get questions from regulatory authorities. So let's just kind of go through how we got here. In significant events that occurred that led us down the road to a lot of data integrity, and it makes sense actually now when you look back in retrospect. In 1989, we did have the generic drug scandal. People did go to jail, and what that was about was companies putting in information for filings that was falsified. It was made up. Okay, it was false data. It looked good, and when it was reviewed, it passed. And so there wasn't that requirement to like compare it to the originator and make sure that you were getting the same bioavailability. They just made up results. So that resulted in the generic drug scandal. And later came in 1993, we had the Barr decision. The company there was Barr Laboratories, and what they were doing was they were testing things into compliance, results, a product. And by that, so they would do a test and they'd get a failure and they would retest it. And then they'd get a passing result. So you have a failed result, a passing result. And then you don't know, when you have two contradictory results, what do? Do you pass the product or do you fail the product? So they would test it again. And then they'd get, 2 out of 3 fail. And then, well, maybe that wasn't right. So let's test it again. That's called testing into compliance. You get one shot at it. You either fail the result or you pass the result. If you fail the result, you do open, out of spec. Everybody's familiar with out of spec and how to go ahead and run that. And what you're trying to determine in the out of spec investigation, and that starts with the laboratory, right? You're trying to determine, was it a true failure on the part of the product, or was it a laboratory error? And there are very stringent requirements of how you follow through the out of spec. And that came a lot out of the Barr decision, okay? We, maybe sometime we'll do something on out of spec. Anyway, from 1990 to 2003, there was a bunch of issuance of consent decrees, and a lot of those had data integrity elements in them, not following data integrity and not conforming to Alcoa standards. In 2005, we had the case of Able Labs. Able Labs was a huge manufacturer of suppositories and pills and capsules, and they actually lost everything because they submitted falsification in their filings, falsified data, again, made up. And then we had Ranbaxy. Anybody who was around in 2013, Ranbaxy had the same thing. They were actually prohibited from providing product to the US for a long time. Now the Avexis 483 in 2019, I call that out. For those of us who were watching the data integrity, this was a company that had clinical trial material, clinical studies, and they were caught in one of the studies with some falsification of data. And it was very interesting. What I was interested in here is not the citation in the 483. It was the response of the company. And the response said that they were going to work with their team and their company to establish a culture of quality. Now that's not where I'm not going to tie it in right here now, but but it will come into play later in the discussion. Next slide. All right, so there are core principles of Alcoa: accuracy, consistency, reliability, and traceability. What I want to do is go through, kind of how we got what each one of these means. And we're going to go through Alcoa, Alcoa Plus, and Alcoa Plus Plus Plus. Now, I'm not going to plus, sorry, 2 pluses. I'm not going to, when we get to Alcoa Plus, I'm not going to repeat Alcoa, so thank goodness, right? The original Alcoa was designed or put into effect before we had a lot of technical advances. I think that's how I would put it. Before there were a lot of electronic systems, pre-LIMS. So we had very paper-driven systems, and the original concepts, Alcoa, were attributable, which means who performed it, not just, the operator man. It needed to be assigned to someone who performed the activity. Legible, and that was can the data be read? Some people at the time, my handwriting's not the neatest, right? So because we were hand recording things at this point in time, there was a concern that the data needed to be legible so people could read it. Contemporaneous really just means, was it recorded? When was the activity done? Was it recorded at the time the activity was carried out? Original, and that means the first capture of the data. Now, this was a lively discussion, if I recall, and I think Jason would recall. It's a lively discussion because original means original. And some people used to write, like they'd take something to the scale and weigh it, and they'd use a little sticky note and record the results, and then they'd go and put it in the laboratory notebook, because we had laboratory notebooks then, right? And you opened it up and you wrote down the batch number, what you were doing, and they'd toss the sticky note away. That violated the concept of original. The original recording of the result was on that sticky note. So if you were into that practice of going over to the scale, weighing it, and putting your results on a sticky note and then transcribing it into your lab notebook, you actually needed to just take that sticky note and put it in your lab notebook to prove that that was the original data recording. Okay, and accurate, is it correct? Did you transpose any digits? Was the date correct? Was the time correct? So that's what we mean by Alcoa. Next slide, I think, right? Okay. Then we went to Alcoa Plus. Now we're starting to get into, the electronic systems. LIMS systems came along. People started to work with electronic batch records. There were documentation, electronic documentation requirements. So we added some elements, and I think this came out, this was more recent. And a lot of it had to do with the assuring the integrity of the data when using electronic systems. So we have added to the original Alcoa of attributable, legible, contemporaneous, original, and accurate, the ideas of complete, consistent, enduring, and available. And by complete, we mean there's no missing data. Consistent is it's a logical data flow. And that really gets to the programming systems. Does it flow logically? Then enduring, can it be retained long term, or does the computer wipe it out in 2 weeks? And available, so can you get at it easily? It's not stored somewhere in somebody's cloud, blah blah blah. Can you get at it easily to show it to inspectors or clients who are auditing you? So recently now, where there's a lot of discussion on, AI and incorporating that kind of learning, the cybersecurity. So recently Alcoa has added, now we can debate the merits of using Alcoa and adding plus, plus, plus later, but the 5 more elements that were added to Alcoa Plus are integrity. So is it protected from changes? That really goes to the programming issues. Nobody can go in and change the data once it's been recorded in your electronic system. Robustness, you can't erase data. Transparency, so can it be viewed? Accountability, who's responsible for going into the computer systems? And reliability, are those systems controlled? We're talking about things like password protection. Each individual who's authorized to use that system actually has a unique password, and we're not sharing systems and everything's original. That audit trails of the programming are in fact consistent and are not, nobody can go in and just change the audit trail. That's kind of the background of where we are today. And then now we're going to go into the much more fun and interesting stuff. I'm going to turn it over to Jason, and he's going to take us through the modern activities of cybersecurity and artificial intelligence. Jason?
Awesome. Thanks. Thank you for that. So as we transition from that pen and paper world that really existed within a silo of the regulatory side of the business, whether it be clinical studies or, on that regulatory side, that those touch points, because it was so manual, didn't have a lot of touch back into the broader ecosystem, which were the corporate environments, the corporate networks. And so if we look at the transition, or if we look at the practical application rather of Alcoa Plus, squared. If we look at that transition and how do we make it practical? How do we make it real? How do we make it live within our corporate and production environments? So our IT environments, the keyboards that you're in front of right now, or your production environments, those that are in clinical offices, or things that are touching, if you're a medical device manufacturer, the things that are touching or interacting with those medical devices. And so we can look at the NIST CIA triad, the CIA, so confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Now, what is so interesting to me about the CIA triad is, in a large macro sense, it covers the idea of attribution, legal, legibility, contemporaneous, original, accurate, complete, consistent, enduring, available, blah, blah, blah. These three buckets encapsulate them, and depending on the industry or what side of the industry that you're on, the C might not come before I, and the I may not come before A. So in other words, you can manipulate the priorities of the CIA triad so that it fits within your sector. So let's take an example. Let's say that I work in the energy sector. Do you think that I would want my systems and data to prioritize confidentiality, integrity, or availability first as an energy company? Now, I'm in Texas, winter is coming. Do you think that I want my energy sector to prioritize availability from a resource perspective, that I can get gas to grandma, that I can keep the lights on? Probably, right? Now let's think about medical devices. Well, probably depending on the class of device. If I was picking a class 3 device, maybe a robot that's performing brain surgery, I want that robot to be up. So I might actually pick availability. But what if I am in within an LIS systems, right? So I maybe want my confidentiality and integrity to come before availability. And so what the CIA triad does is it allows us as internal policymakers and doers, fingers on keyboard folks, to prioritize the protections that are appropriate to, using the FDA's parlance, harm to patient and harm to patient data. So if we look at that, we can then expand the NIST, so National Institute of Science and Technology, Standards and Technology, which is kind of a US base, everybody falls under this. We can then look at FDA. So next slide, the FDA uses that CIA triad to then talk about the concept of secure by design. So again, if we think about all of the data that we have, and then we expand those ideas of complete and consistent and enduring and available, well, we can add different words. What about non-repudiation? So that gets to some of the Alcoa pieces. Who did it? When did they do it? And why did they do it? Immutable. I want that audit log that keeps non-repudiation. In other words, I don't have the ability to say, no, that wasn't me, because HIPAA and other things have requirements for unique logins. Why do we think that is? It's because we want the data to be accurate. We want it to be complete and consistent and enduring. And the only way it can be enduring is if we know who made the change, why they made the change, and when. So the non-repudiation and immutable, we don't want a person like me a senior cyber person to go in who might actually have legitimate access to these audit logs and make a change. And so as we design our systems, whether you're in the HDO side, healthcare delivery organization side, or the MDM side, medical device manufacturer side, which is where I've spent most of my time, our challenges of this secure by design is how do I incorporate these principles of the CIA triad, these principles of Alcoa into the product at the start? And this was a real struggle, because what I've seen personally, and this is a true story for me personally, I joined a company a while ago, about 4 or 5 years ago, and I was their first senior cybersecurity hire. But that company had been around for 5 years and already had 2 FDA cleared products. I won't name the company. But I came in and I looked at the Alcoa principles, and I looked at the CIA triad, and I looked at the secure by design requirement that the FDA lays out. And I said, where's our audit logs? Oh, we didn't actually develop the system from the start to incorporate audit logs, and to do so would darn near crash our system because it wasn't built for that. And so we now have to swim upstream, take away resources from our production, new product development, new product design, enhancing existing products, and take them away to fulfill these data integrity requirements. And don't get it twisted. These are not optional. And part of the difficulty, and there's probably a data privacy officer or a data security officer in the audience listening to this, they know that while we carry a big stick, we really should carry a carrot, because we try to guide them and say, we have to do this, and here's why, and here's what will happen if we don't. And trust me, if we don't, it's bad. And we'll get into in a later slide why it's bad and what has happened to other people. So the FDA has made some changes recently. And if we look at, well, how do we solve this? How do we get that secure by design? In other words, how do we get secure out of the gate? There's a reason that the FDA is really pushing the idea of threat modeling, a term you may or may not be aware of. It's reasonably new to our sector. It's probably been around 2 years in its true implementation, but it's really gotten teeth in the past year. Anybody that's gone through a de novo or 510K truly probably knows this word by now. But it's the idea of figuring out, so the principles of a threat model is, what do we want to do? That's our design features. We've got a new product, right? What do we want to do with the product? Design features. We all know design features. We used to go from design features to design system requirements. Well, now there's a middle step. So now we've got threat modeling. So it's, what do we want to do? What is our features? What can go wrong? Our threat model. What are we going to do about it? SRS, so system requirements, software requirements. And then it goes on from there. What can go wrong? What are we going to do about it? And then the controls, did we do a good enough job? Where you get into risk management principles. And that's why the threat modeling was in there, because it allows us to get ahead of this, oh, we need threat modeling, or we need an audit log, right? And all that should be in your threat model. So determining your priorities of the CIA triad, which is a resource conversation internally. Well, yeah, we want all 3. But if I had to pick one to really prioritize, do I want a robust system, or do I want to make sure that all the data is complete and accurate and enduring? Well, we want that. But again, we have to make decisions. We can't just snap our fingers and we get all these principles. We have to make prioritized decisions. And the CIA triad allows us to do that, right? And then, of course, when we're documenting the regulatory requirements, that's where that SRS document comes in, because we can say, hey, we are secure by design. We have our design features. We have our threat model. We have our SRS. And here's the proof in the pudding. So next slide. So that's how you kind of design a product to look forward into the future. But if we talk about data, we can't just say data, air quote the word data. We all know PHI is different than PII, right? In the US, we certainly know that. So in the US, we have these ideas of safe harbor. And it gets very confusing for a lot of people, because the way that I treat clinician data, so the user that is using my medical device, the way that I treat that data, which is truly PII data, their name, maybe their email address, their IP address, where they work location, things of that sort, that's truly PII. But the moment that I start talking about JSON, right? Or the moment that I put in a medical record a URL or a serial number or you know, a PID, so patient ID 4422, well, you can link, if I hacked the system or access to the system, I can find out that 4422 is actually Jason Tugman. Well, that makes it PHI now. And the way that we deal with that and understand that, in our world, we've got two types of patient data, right? We've got identifying data and de-identified data. And if you've ever done clinical studies, you truly know that you want to be working with de-identified data as much as possible, because it lowers a lot of bars of data transparency and cross-border transfers. A lot of studies happen in the EU and UK for US companies, things of that sort. And so these safe harbor is 18 classifications of safe harbor. If you have even one of these linked to a patient, your data is not de-identified data, period, full stop. So we have to look, we have to plan our clinical studies, we have to plan our information systems, we have to plan our production environments. If I've got an AWS database in the back end that I want maybe a data researcher to, you know, plumb the data and see what interesting papers what, you know, interesting clinical decisions we might be able to come out of this, I want to remove these attributes so that this researcher can have access to it without these huge barriers of entry that I now, as a cybersecurity professional, have to log and monitor. So that's in the US. We have two classifications, right? Well, three. We've got PHI, identified PHI, de-identified, well, it's still called de-identified PHI. And then we've got PII, personally identifiable information. But that's in the US. Next slide. What if we're going to go into the GDPR land? Now, I use GDPR as a global catch-all because UK DPA, PIPEDA, you know, all these other countries really follow GDPR. So I use GDPR as a global catch-all because the requirements are far closer for a GDPR perspective than they would be to a US perspective. And I think as a US company, really puts you on the back foot if you're looking at a US rollout strategy, but ultimately a 5-year plan of a UK or EU or Canada or really anywhere. Those data strategies, you know, your prioritizations are going to differ because their classification doesn't say, is it personal data or is it patient data? No, they say it is just personal data. Everything is personal data. Medical data is personal data with a special classification, medical data, and there's other classifications in there as well. And so we can't just rip out the data, rip out these safe harbor attributes and call it done. We have to go through these steps, the pseudonymization step, and then finally an anonymized data step. To get to anonymized, I have to go through the pseudo data process. So I can't go from personal data directly to anonymized. It's a lot like in 3rd grade, we had to show our work. So our audit logs, we have to have that complete, consistent, enduring, and available audit log to show how the data was transformed into pseudo data. So recognized data into pseudo data. And then finally into anonymized data. Anonymized data is as close as we can get from what we call de-identified data. But the difference is de-identified data can just be stored in an adjunct database, and we might be able to recombine that at some point and make that back into identified data if we so needed to. And there's ways to do that. Anonymized data has this hard requirement of there is no possibility of putting that data back into a pseudo state or into a personally identified state. And again, we have to show our work when we do this. So again, as we look at data integrity and how we put our controls in place, we have to, from the start, secure by design, we have to understand where our data is coming from and what our corporate strategy is, not at the launch, because again, we don't want to swim this GDPR upstream. Trust me, your systems will not be capable of doing it. Time, money, and resources will be wasted. So make the plan early and implement it as, or at least know it's going to be there. So next slide. I want to transition to the conversation of AI. So now we're collecting data from all kinds of sources, and we're doing things with data that really weren't planned for way back in the day of pen and paper, Alcoa, no pluses added to the end, right? And so now from a clinical data perspective, collecting data for clinical studies, using data to make, to assist clinicians. In the middle, we have old school, human process, clinical decision-making. By clinical decision-making, we mean the decision maker is a clinician, be it a physician, a nurse, a practitioner, whomever they are, right? They are making the decision. But now with AI, we have really two camps to swim in. We have two types of products that we can develop. And the way that you develop these products from an FDA, UK, and I'll get into the next slide in a minute to show you how the world is taking this so seriously, we have to understand that AI can really do two things for us. They can do clinical decision support, or they can do clinical decision making. So let's take examples. Clinical decision support. Let's say that I've got a stethoscope, and that stethoscope looks for heart murmurs, right? There's a couple companies out there that do that. And so I, as a clinician, use this AI-enabled stethoscope. I go through my auscultation, and it can say one of two things. There may be a heart murmur, or there is a heart murmur, right? And using that word is a very risky word to use from a barrier of entry perspective. And so what a lot of companies do is they say, hey, clinician, there may be a heart murmur, take a closer listen, allowing the clinician to have that decision support. There may be, but once we get into decision making, there is, and again, all this will be in the IFU, the indication of use. It's all in there. And so if you do clinical decision support, you're probably going to be a class 2 device, but as soon as you start making those decisions, be prepared for potential class 3 designation, because you're essentially removing the clinician's decision-making oversight, and you're entering that domain of autonomous clinical decision-making, right? High risk, SAMD, FDR, IMDRF, et cetera, high bars of entry. So we have to understand, I can't just say, I've got an AI product. Okay. And if I'm a clinician, what's useful for you is when a salesperson comes in your office, hey, I got this slick little AI tool, ask them, is it support or making? And if it's making, ask a lot of questions. Ask a lot of questions. So next slide. So we have to look at kind of the risks that are there, and I've touched on some of those already, right? So AI-based clinical decision support and AI clinical decision making, again, it just speaks to the autonomous nature of clinical decision making and how high risk it is for not only the manufacturers and the clinicians, but certainly to the patients. Again, our ethos is harm to patient and harm to patient data. So globally, next slide, what have we done about this? One of the things that I really appreciated about the FDA, and I'll name drop Suzanne Schwartz specifically at the FDA, she's done a really amazing job of communicating to us, the cyber and regulatory practitioners, if you will, what's coming. And she signaled to us years ago, back when I was a director of cybersecurity and regulatory affairs at a medical device manufacturer, right? She clued us in, at this point, 3 or 4 years ago, that, hey, AI regulation, AI guidance is coming to the United States. But we're going to follow the UK, because she knew through talking and really looking at that globalization, trying to make it easier to market entry outside of the US, which used to be a real struggle under MDR and IMDRF and all these other things. So she purposely followed the globe, and I thought it was so smart. So we had the UK guidance that came out, then the EU guidance that came out, and these are drafts. I think the EU one got finalized first, but the drafts came out. And then finally, in January of just this year, the FDA AI guidance was released. Now it was in draft, it still is in draft, guidance take 3 or 4 years to finalize, but I already knew what it was going to be. And at the time I was working for an AI-enabled medical device company. So I was able to read those tea leaves and prepare a 3- and 5-year roadmap for what we would have to do with AI. So what's in this AI guidance? Let's dig into it. Next slide. The AI guidance is pretty short, but there's one page, and I don't off the top of my head remember, but the section numbers are here. You can look at it for yourself. From a medical device perspective, the FDA uses the word trustworthy. They want a cyber secure device, right? They want a trustworthy medical device. Well, in the AI world in the FDA, we use the word credibility. We want the data to be credible. It gets back to that Alcoa principle, right? Attributable, legible, contemporaneous, original, accurate, complete, consistent, enduring, and available. All of that speaks to the credibility of the data set. And so there really are 7 principles of decision making that we should go through. And just know that the word COU, that is context of use. How is the data going to be used? If we don't start with context, we don't know what standards and rules and strictures we should have around it. So these are the 7 steps. I'm not going to read them to you. You've got eyeballs, take a screenshot and read it for yourself. But they're here, and these are direct copies from the actual guidance. And I think they're on, it's like page 14 or something, 7 or whatever it is. You'll find it. It's easy. And it's all right there. But these are the processes that we go through to establish and prove out the risk of the context of use of the data models that we will be using. Now, remember, we are now using AI in clinical trials and collecting data. And so it gets to these ideas of biases, and it gets to this idea of, the cohorts and the data that are in there, not only from a decision-making bias perspective, but from a, maybe a racial perspective or, a gender perspective. And so all of these are within this idea of context of use. So let's make it practical. Let's go to the next step. Let's say you've sat back and you've listened to Susan and I, and you're like, cool story, bro. What do I do? Like, neat. Tell me what to do. Well, if we look at these, what is this? What are we looking at? We're looking at Alcoa. So what are the practical risk management strategies that we can implement for each of these? And I've laid out 3 bullets under each of these Alcoa ++ principles to give you a starting point. Again, I'm not going to read these to you, but if you look at them, they're really pretty obvious if you're an experienced, maybe cyber professional, but maybe if you're not, maybe you're head of regulatory affairs. How do you go back and say, okay, but we need to make sure our data is accurate? Well, let's use some checksums. What's a checksum? The file size attaches what's called a hash. It gives a number. And if I go in and change a period to an exclamation point, that number will naturally change. And then I can check that hash, and I can make sure that the integrity of the file, therefore the file is as accurate as I anticipated it to be. And so these are just simple ways to implement some of these data strategies around Alcoa. And the last slide that I'll talk about, next slide, is something that is actually pretty near and dear to my heart. And it's around data pruning. Because if we think about data protections and integrity and our responsibilities, if we've got these huge data sets and we're not pruning our data set, in other words, do I still need this data? Do I still need this data in the state that it is in? I have 15 million, which is a very small number, by the way, 15 million PHI records, US-based PHI records. But some of those data are 5 years old that, maybe isn't needed anymore. Can I transition that data into a safer state, into a de-identified state? Same thing with GDPR requirements. If I'm not pruning my data, which is either removing it, now we have to look at rules around data, requirements of keeping your data. I'm not going to get any of that 5 years after the life of the individual, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But do I need to keep all this into a single master database, or can I offload this into an icebox so that I can keep it for 20 years? But if I have this bloated database, a cyber hack, I always tell people, you never want to be above the fold. What is above the fold? You open up the Sunday newspaper and the name of your company is above the fold of the newspaper, and it ain't because you've been doing a good job, right? And a key way of doing that is for companies that don't do data pruning. They don't downsize the risk of their data, whether taking it from identified to de-identified, whether taking out some of those properties to make your data pseudo data or even anonymized data if you have global data. So these are the principles and ideas that you need to think about, that you're the protector of this huge data set. But why do you need to be the protector of a huge data set when all your operational data is maybe operating on 20% of that data, but it's all still commingled into a single environment? That to me is risky. That to me is not, from a risk perspective. Just think about the cyber insurance that you would be able to save if you could downgrade from 50 million in cyber to 20 million in cyber insurance, just because you did a data pruning exercise. So these are the things that keep me up at night. These are the things that I think about. And so what I want to do now is I want to transition back, now that we kind of have this idea of what Alcoa is, what some of these practical applications and implications are, I want to head it back over to Susan, and we'll talk about some ethics and oversight in the next slide.
Thank you, Jason. So first, what I want to do is just ground everybody in kind of what we're going to talk about. This is what I call the compliance curve. And the way it's structured is, you can see that good compliance follows the CFR, Code of Federal Regulations, right? And the Code of Federal Regulations establish what is to be done. It doesn't tell you how to do it. So every once in a while, you're following the hierarchy of the CFR, then the guidelines that FDA issues, and then, of course, you've got best practice documents and other standards. So with how fast this is moving in the industry, it's not surprising to see that sometimes you're going to dip below the compliance, the CFR compliance. And that would be a 483 or the guideline compliance, right? And as we'll talk about, this is the minimum requirement. This is the minimum you have to do is maintain compliance to the CFR. When you drop out of compliance significantly, you have the red line below the CFR line, and that means you've got, warning letters, 483s, consent decrees, you've lost business, and it's costing your company a lot of money. When people get into this state, it's hard to recover, and what they usually end up doing is over recovering. So they go way above what the compliance level they need to go in order to bring themselves back into compliance. That's an overcorrection. And that's what I call urban legend compliance. So let me give you an example. One of the observations a company got was for not securing their records, which goes directly to data integrity, right? They weren't secured. And so their result, this was way back in the day when we still had paper files and stuff. So their correction, they made a few corrections, but the inspectors still weren't satisfied. So they overcorrected by ordering fireproof, waterproof cabinets to store the documents in. And they had to have an architectural study because those cabinets were going to be stored on the second floor, and nobody knew. If you are familiar with those, they're very heavy, and it takes a lot to hold them. So they had to have, weight-bearing studies on their second floor where the documents were kept. And then what happened was so then everybody was happy. Okay, you've got them secured. But they went around telling everybody, well, this is how, if you get this observation, you need to go out and buy these cabinets. So there was like a run on fireproof, waterproof cabinets in the industry, and everybody was using them. It created this kind of urban legend about what to do when you have a observation of not keeping your records safe and guarded. So I just want to, this is where we're going to get into the minimum requirements, you know, and the discussion on ethics. So let's move. I hope that's clear to everybody. So let's kind of move to ethics and oversight. As Jason and I have both said, this is moving really fast, and keeping up with data integrity during the generic scandal and today, it's totally different. And it can tie directly to your quality management systems. Risk-based decision making, patient safety should be foremost. And then, you know, how you, when you come up with the ideas for these products and you're using, you know, IRBs, what's the ethics you need to look for there? So let's talk about ethics. Anybody have any questions on Brandon? You got some questions you wanna?
Well, yeah, we've got one more slide here, but I think I'll add to what you're going to here. In my personal experience, one of the new things that I've seen, and again, if you're an MDM, if you're a manufacturer, one of the things that I have seen back at my previous company was that, as you know, when you go into a new organization, or if you start a new clinical study, and this was true, we did a lot of clinical studies in the UK. In fact, most of our clinical studies were in the UK, using these huge UK data sets through a partnership through the government. And we had to start going through, and more we started seeing this trend of these AI approval boards. Now you've got the IRBs, and we've talked about kind of the ethics in the IRBs, but now we're starting to see these AI approval boards, which are really adjacent to these IRBs. So you get your clinical study, is it, you know, ethical, is it the right study at the right time with the right cohort, et cetera, et cetera. Now we're looking at the data set. Well, what are you collecting, or what are you using? So, you know, we did a veterinary study. Well, they wanted to know, you know, where the data came from, and we were doing human studies, and we already had this large data set. They wanted to know, where did this data come from? And they look at your biases, and they look at these decisions, this context of use, now that we're kind of coining that term, the FDA is coining that term. And so as a practitioner, I will just tell you, if you're out there, whether you're doing clinical studies, or if you're a manufacturer, or if you're an HDO, I have personally seen the trend of the AI approval board becoming a new, I'll call it a barrier, but it's also just another check in the process. We've got our security assessments that we do. Obviously, if you're doing your IRB boards, if you're doing your studies, but we're now seeing AI boards on both sides of that before they start allowing you to use your AI-enabled device within their clinical environment. They want to make sure they are doing their due diligence, because it wouldn't be my fault. I mean, it would be, but ultimately it wouldn't be maybe the name of my previous company above the fold. It would be that very large hospital network. Their name would be above the fold if it was discovered we had some crazy bias in our AI data set, right?
Okay.
And so these AI approval boards are becoming the norm. And so if we go to our last slide on the regulatory horizon, this is new. In fact, one of my colleagues here at RCA, actually, I think he's at Nelson Labs, he and I were having a discussion the other day, and he's on a lot of ISO boards, and he's really involved with standards development globally. I'm mostly focused on US and actually Canadian standards, but he's really focused on global standards and working on the working groups. And he dropped this huge list. And all of this is AI related, but if you just look down this, and if you think about those Alcoa principles, each of these in some way touch what that, you know, one or more of those Alcoa principles in the use of AI, whether it be, again, for clinical studies, whether it be for evaluations, whether it be for clinical decision support, clinical decision making. So this is what's on the board. This is what's on the horizon. So if we think, oh, well, we've got the UK, EU, and US AI guidance coming out, no. That's the tip of the iceberg.
Okay.
We will see these in our world in the next 3 to 5 years.
Wow. You know, it's to me, it's a new horizon, because I come, you know, I was in the industry when the Barr decision and stuff was being made. So I remember that, and it's sometimes hard for me to get my head around the fact that people aren't using, there still are some paper systems out there, but most people have gone to this, you know, the electronic systems, and it takes my mind some adjustment to say, this is a whole new world. And how do we control the data? Because the AI learns really fast. And how do we know that it's learning correctly? And right?
Right, and I think if we go to our last slide here before we get into Q&A, I think you touched on those key takeaways. I think that what we can do, you know, I'll just say we can look through these, but I want to get to some questions, so I'll be quick. I'll just go right to the last bullet here, and Susan, add one of your favorites as well. Mine is don't go it alone. Regulations are changing so fast. And I know back when I was a practitioner, now turned consultant, you know, I didn't have time as a practitioner to keep up. And so don't go it alone. My entire job now is to keep up with this stuff. My entire job is to keep up with the changing world of FDA requirements, be it AI, be it the new requirements that came out in June of this year from the FDA for cyber, you know, be it whatever it is. That's my full-time job now. And so leverage folks like RCA, sales pitch, leverage folks like us, ask questions to people like us, so that we can take and be that partner for you to help guide those principles, that 1 year, 5 year roadmap to make sure that you're not back to swimming upstream, especially for those existing and maturing markets.
I think the one I like is to be prepared for future disruptors, because it's coming. This is moving so fast, it's hard for everyone to keep up with, including the regulators.
Yeah, I totally agree. Totally agree with that. So, Brendan, I'll send it to you for questions.
Yeah, thank you, Sue and Jason, for your insights. We've got some great information from you both, and we've got a lot to think about. We did get some questions while you guys were speaking, so let's address those now. If we don't get to specific questions, we'll be happy to address them individually after we conclude today. But to start it off, the Barr decision data requirements seem much higher for the UK and EU companies. How best can a US company without a current international strategy prepare?
So I will tell you, I was in the United States Marine Corps way long time ago, but I always took a principle away from that, and it was protect your assets. It's easier to protect all of your assets the same way that it is to have leveling, ways of protecting your data. So if I know that I'm going to have a GDPR standard in my organization in 3 years, I'm going to start protecting my data. Now, that doesn't mean using data. That means I'm going to start developing my system, my protections, my moats and barbed wire, if you will, the same way that I treat my low-level data, because it's in the same database, whether it's US data or UK data. But if I start acting as if all of my data is UK data, now that doesn't mean that I have to go through anonymization and pseudonymization for US data, but if I've got those processes in place, if I've got those policies, if I've worked with regulatory in the right way, where we've got a check and balance, we brought in a new customer, we'll ask the question, what's the source of the data? Is it international? Yes or no? Great. Now I can start mapping my data. I can start putting in these GDPR requirements, data mapping being one of them. I can start doing that, and that muscle memory is there. Well, what I don't want to do is I don't want to get to T-3 months where we'll start opening up to UK or EU markets, or even PIPEDA, which is Canadian markets, and then try and swim upstream to make sure I've got all my stuff in order. Start acting as if. You don't have to treat all data, but if you start putting those muscle memory places and those audit logs and data mapping, build it into your process slowly. That way it's not a whiplash when I get T-3 months. So that would be is just start rolling it out. Work with your senior leaders, figure out what your data strategy needs to be in 5 years, and start slowly working towards them. Otherwise, we're just gonna have a big boatload of work right when we're trying to launch a new product or a new area. And then I, as the data manager, regulatory manager, whatever, I have to be the bad cop. I don't want to do that. I want to swim slowly slowly downstream. I don't want to be the person in the boat paddling everybody else back upstream. That would be my advice.
Yeah, I really like your advice about treating all data pretty much the same, protecting all your assets, because the last thing you want to do is be protecting, if you're not protecting the lower level data, I don't know what exactly to call it, but the kind of peripheral data you might have. If you protect that like you're protecting your bus data, then that won't bring you down. How many times is it the peripheral data that actually stops things in their tracks, right? Because you didn't protect that sufficiently, and it just keeps leading you to the higher level data, which, that you don't want to go down for that reason.
Right, and it adds to that whole idea of data pruning as well. Don't
Yep.
protect something you no longer need. That's just silly.
Right.
Yeah, going off of that the strategy question there, what is the best way to go about incorporating AI into a current connected device, and what would be the first steps of ensuring that my data is secure?
Oh boy, into an existing device. Well,
Existing connected device.
yeah, of course, yeah. So a connected device. So whenever you're looking at AI, you're most typically going to be looking at a internet-enabled device. And so start getting your infrastructure in place, which it hopefully probably already is. But if you're adding it to an existing connected medical device, I would have a conversation with the FDA and make sure that you don't need to go, which I'm sure you probably would, go back through a 510K process, because you're adding in a decision support or decision making component that wasn't there when you had that initial IFU. So that will definitely change. It probably won't change your classification, hopefully, fingers crossed. Unless you're going from a class 1, you'll probably be at class 2 at that point. But hopefully you won't transition into a class 3 unless you're doing decision making. But I would say, honestly, call me. Let's have a quick conversation. And then your next call should probably be to the FDA and say, hey, I want to use a new data set. And then, to be very honest with you, you've got an existing connected medical device. I don't know the size of the company of the person asking this question, but start talking to your customers, because I've been on the other side of that fence as an MDM provider, and I've seen some really strong pushback if I radically change my device, an existing device, because it will also have different components from an IT implementation perspective, but also if you're cooking into LIS or HIS systems, that's going to change as well. So I'll truncate it and say, treat it like a new device. That's probably how I should have opened. Treat it like a new device. I will tell you, it's very, 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 very possible, but it isn't just as, and I'm air quoting this, as easy as adding a new data set to an existing product. You really should treat it as a new product. Fascinating though. I'd love to hear from you.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I would love to get to a couple more, but unfortunately we are out of time here as we're getting to the hour. But I want to thank you both, Sue and Jason, again for going through all this informative information. And I'd also like to thank the viewers that were able to attend today. I hope you found this to be a valuable experience, and we will be sending this webinar to you, so it'll be available on demand as soon as we get this uploaded. So thank you all again, and have a wonderful day.
Thanks.